In this video, we'll be examining the HTML helpers within the ASP.NET MVC views and how we can utilize those in the creation and naming of our HTML controls, as well as other markup within the page. What you're looking at here is the view that we have been using for the last half of our week 3 and our prior week 4 lectures. And what you'll see when we covered is that we have these input tags that generate text boxes, and we've given them unique names such as first name, last name, email, and password, and those correlate to the user view model class that we created. We have properties in here: our first name, last name, email, and password. And looking at our home controller, you'll see that we are using that user view model as part of the HTTP post, and we're essentially taking these fields, first name, last name, email, and password, and we're binding them into this model class or model object upon postback, and the MVC framework is doing that work for us. Now, with something as flat as first name, last name, email, and phone, it's not too hard to guess the name of those input fields. However, things can get much more complicated when you have more complex model classes. So the team at Microsoft has actually come up with a tool or a utility to help us in making these controls easier and not having to worry so much about the naming conventions. So to do that, we have what are called HTML helper methods. So I'm going to start by replacing the first name tag with the HTML helper equivalent. Now we have to use the @ sign because this is Razor C# markup. So it's @HTML dot. Then you'll see that we have a whole collection of different methods we can call things for checkboxes, for display for, drop down lists, editors, form, elements, hidden, and so forth. And what we're looking for is down at the bottom, it's text box, and you'll see that we have a text box and a text box for. And I'll get into the details of that in a moment, but we're going to go ahead and use text box for, and I'll do an open parenthesis, and you'll notice that what this is expecting is a system.link.expressions.expression, so an expression object, and that object takes in a function, and that function takes in a object of user view model, and then it returns a T property. We'll talk about those details more in a later lecture when we kind of deconstruct lambda expressions, function delegates, and all of those things. But for now, I want to just focus on the basic syntax of what we're doing here. So text box for, and then we're going to say model item, which will be our model, and then we're going to do equals, and then a kind of a caret, and it'll create an arrow, and then we'll say model item dot first name, close parenthesis. And essentially what we're doing here is we're saying that we need a text box for the model item first name. So as you'll see when we save and run this, we will actually end up getting the same HTML output by calling this helper method instead of hand coding the markup. So if we right click and say view page source, here's our input. The only real difference is it gives the control an ID, a first name. There's our name, first name. Our type is text, and then explicitly defines the value as empty string. So it's actually slightly more verbose than what we had coded, but we now have the ability to reference this control via JavaScript using the ID. We also have an explicit value determined. And the beauty of this is also the fact that if our model actually had values, those values would be embedded into the control, and we'd actually see that value coming through the page upon load. So let's go through and we'll just replace all of these. And again, the concept is very similar. So HTML text box 4, and we'll do model item, and it'll be model item dot last name. And here we're going to kind of do the same thing, and I'm going to change it up a little bit because I want you to be aware of kind of an understanding of the pieces. So I'm going to do add HTML text box 4, and then when I open my parenthesis, this time instead of typing model item, I'm going to do x, my arrow, x dot email, close parenthesis. And the reason I make that change is because this value on the left of the arrow is really just a variable name, and then on the right side of the arrow we're referencing the variable from the left side, so they have to match and they have to be the same. You'll also notice here model item with a capital I, but then the line above it was model item with a lowercase I, and therefore it had to match on the other side. And if you mouse over this, you'll also see that it says that model item is of type user view model. Model item here is also user view model, and X is also user view model. And that's intentional because what's happening here is that when this method is called, this method picks up our model for this view, which is a user view model, and it passes that in to this what's called a lambda expression. So this is actually the same as us coming up here and saying this dot model, or as we did down here on lines 20 or lines 30 through 33, where we say model dot. It's all the same. The only real difference is that you're wrapping up some of this functionality on lines 18, 19, 20, then soon to be 21, and you're just using these helper methods to do that work. So this variable is just another reference back to your model. So again, we'll do HTML dot text box 4, and again I'll do x arrow x dot password and save. Now these changes were made to the view, so there's no need for me to stop and rebuild. I can jump back to my HTML and I can simply refresh this page. Those changes will be picked up, and then we now have our controls again. If I right click and view source, take this full screen, we'll see here is our last name with an ID now and a value, email, and password.